The year is 1849. Deep in the Rocky Mountains, where the wind howls through granite passes and the nearest settlement is 3 days' hard ride away, a man named Ezekiel Cray is doing something that makes every soul who passes by stop dead in their tracks. He is digging, not panning a river, not sifting a creek bed. He is driving a pickaxe directly into the face of a mountain. The settlers call it madness. They mutter behind their hands and shake their heads. Some say he's lost his mind from too many winters alone. Others say he's digging his own grave. A few of the more charitable ones think maybe he's just looking for a water spring or burying something he doesn't want found. But none of them, not a single one, think he's going to pull anything valuable out of solid rock with nothing but hand tools and sheer stubbornness. Ezekiel Cray doesn't care what they say. He's read something in these rocks that no one else can see, and he's betting his life on it. What happens next will test every ounce of his strength, his knowledge, and his sheer will to survive. This is the story of a man who went to war with a mountain and almost didn't come back. Ezekiel Cray wasn't always a mountain man. He'd come west like thousands of others during the gold rush years, full of fire and ambition, with a pack on his back and a head full of stories about men who'd scooped fortunes out of California stream beds with nothing more than a tin pan and good luck. But somewhere along the journey, somewhere between Missouri and the first real look at the Rockies, rising out of the plains like a wall built by God, something shifted in him. Unlike the masses who crowded the riverbeds with their tin pans and wooden sluice boxes, Cray had spent years before his journey reading everything he could get his hands on. Geological texts, miners' journals going back decades, reports from Spanish prospectors who had worked these mountains a full century before the American rush, men who'd scratched wealth out of this same wilderness before most of the men now flooding into it were even born. He knew something the other men didn't. Gold doesn't just show up in rivers by accident. Rivers carry it there, from somewhere, from a source. And that source was almost always the same thing, a quartz vein buried deep inside the mountain itself. The river gold, the flakes and nuggets that every man with a pan was chasing, that was just the runoff. The crumbs that had broken loose over thousands of years of erosion and washed downhill. The real deposit, the mother lode, was still up in the rock where it had always been, waiting for someone patient enough and crazy enough to go in after it. While every other prospector followed the water, Cray followed the rock. He'd been traveling through the Rockies for 6 weeks when he found it, a high ridgeline in the San Juan Range, the kind of place most men avoided because the terrain was brutal and there was no easy water access. But Cray wasn't looking for easy water. He was looking at the cliff face exposed by an ancient rock slide, and what he saw made him drop to his knees. White quartz, running in thick veins through the gray granite like the fingers of a buried hand. In certain lights, under the right angle of the afternoon sun, those veins shimmered with something else. Something dull yellow, something heavy-looking in a way that had nothing to do with the light and everything to do with what it actually was. Cray pulled out his iron knife and scraped at the surface. He pressed the flakes to his tongue, an old prospector's trick, because gold has a distinct metallic density that your body recognizes even if your eyes aren't sure. He held the flakes up to the light and turned them slowly. They didn't sparkle, they didn't flash, they just glowed, steady and dull, the way only one thing in nature glows like that. He didn't say a word. He just stood up, walked back to his mule, and started unpacking his tools. Now, here's where this story gets fascinating, because Ezekiel Cray wasn't some industrial miner with a crew and equipment. He was one man, alone in the wilderness, with what he could carry on the back of a single mule. No dynamite, no drill crews, No engineer measuring stress loads or calculating tunnel geometry, just hand tools, hard-won knowledge, and the kind of determination that either makes a man a legend or gets him quietly killed in the dark. His primary weapon against the mountain was a steel pickaxe, heavy with a hand-carved hickory handle he'd replaced twice already on the journey. The pick was used to score and break rock, driving into natural fractures in the granite and prying loose chunks of stone. In hard rock, this was agonizingly slow work. In a single day, a man working alone might advance a tunnel 6 inches, maybe a foot on a good day if the rock cooperated. Most days the rock did not cooperate, but Cray had a second trick up his sleeve, one that mountain men and old-world miners had used for centuries before a stick of dynamite was ever invented: fire setting. The technique was brutal in its simplicity. You build a massive fire directly against the rock face. You let it burn for hours, sometimes all night, heating the granite until the stone itself begins to expand under the thermal load. Then, at the right moment, you throw cold water onto the superheated surface. The thermal shock causes the rock to crack, fracture, and crumble in on itself. Fissures open up that didn't exist before. Sections of stone that would have taken hours of pickwork to loosen simply fall away. What took a pickaxe an hour fire setting could accomplish in minutes. The risks were obvious and they were serious. An enclosed space with fire means smoke. Smoke in a tunnel means you pass out before you realize you're dying. Cray had to work the fires at the tunnel entrance in the early stages, driving cracks deep into the rock face before following them further in. He learned to read the mountain sounds, the deep, resonant groaning of rock under thermal stress, the sharp crack like a rifle shot that meant a fracture was running true and clean, and the terrifying sudden silence that meant something was about to give way on its own schedule, not his. As the tunnel grew deeper, he built wooden supports. He'd learned basic timbering from an old Welsh miner he'd met in St. Louis, a small weathered man named Griffith who'd survived 3 cave-ins in the coal mines of his home country and wore each one like a badge he'd rather not have earned. The principle was straightforward: cut upright posts from the straightest pine trunks you could find, cap them with a heavy crossbeam, and drive the uprights tight against the tunnel walls so the whole frame was under compression. Done right, the supports transferred the weight of the mountain overhead into the floor rather than down onto your skull. Done wrong, or done with green timber that hadn't dried properly, or spaced too far apart, or built without understanding the specific load characteristics of the rock above you, and you ended up as another unmarked grave in the wilderness. The mountains were full of those, men who'd gone in and hadn't come back out, and nobody left who knew quite where they'd gone or what had brought the ceiling down on top of them. Cray thought about those men. He thought about them every time he set a new support. He worked through the fall, through October's early snows that dusted the ridgeline white each morning and melted by noon, through November when the temperature at altitude dropped to places that turned spit to ice before it hit the ground, and the wind came off the high peaks with a cutting edge that felt personal. He built a small log shelter at the tunnel entrance, just big enough for himself and his bedroll, and he worked by the light of tallow candles he'd rendered himself from the fat of an elk he took early in the season. He ate what he could hunt and trap. He slept when he had to. He dug every other waking hour. The surrounding settlers, a small community of families who'd established a rough-cut trading post and homestead cluster in the valley below, watched him with a mixture of pity and contempt. They sent their children up occasionally to stare at the crazy man on the mountain. The men came less often, offering unsolicited opinions about the futility of his enterprise before heading back down to their more sensible pursuits of farming and timber. One man, a former Ohio farmer named Harker, who fancied himself a practical thinker, told Cray directly that a man his age ought to know better than to throw his life away on a hole in a hill. Cray thanked him politely and went back to work. By midwinter, his hands were permanently cracked and bleeding from the cold and the constant friction of the pickaxe handle. He'd lost nearly 30 pounds. His face had gone to leather. His mule had gone lame, and he'd had to walk 6 miles down to the trading post to swap it for a younger animal, carrying his own gear on his back, because he couldn't afford to leave his tools unattended on the mountain overnight. But the tunnel was going somewhere. He could feel it in the way a man sometimes knows things that he can't fully explain. A change in the quality of the rock, a density to the darkness ahead that felt different from the darkness behind. He could feel it. The quartz vein had disappeared twice on him, gone suddenly gray and dead, leaving him staring at barren granite in the candlelight with a cold pit in his stomach and 3 months of work looking like folly. Both times he'd forced himself to stop, to sit, to map what he knew about the direction the vein had been traveling, the angle of the surrounding rock strata, the way the fractures were running. Both times he'd calculated where the vein most likely continued and dug sideways to find it. Both times he'd been right. The vein was still there, just shifting the way these things do, following its own ancient logic through the guts of the mountain, indifferent to the small, desperate creature scratching after it. And with every foot he pushed deeper, the gold traces in the quartz were getting heavier. It was late February when the storm came. Cray had learned to read mountain weather over his years in the high country. You had to, or you died, but this one moved faster than any he'd encountered. A blue-black wall of cloud came rolling in from the northwest in the space of a single afternoon, and by the time he recognized it for what it was, the wind was already screaming through the canyon below, and the temperature had dropped 15 degrees in an hour. The kind of storm that didn't give you options, the kind that killed livestock and men who made poor decisions with equal indifference. He should have retreated to his shelter. Any sensible man would have. He knew it even as he kept moving forward. But he was close. He could feel it in the rock itself, in the way the candlelight played off surfaces that were increasingly laced with visible color, in the way the quartz had thickened and brightened over the last 10 feet of tunnel. He pushed 20 more minutes into the darkness, following the vein as it curved around a bend in the rock, and the tunnel opened unexpectedly into a small natural cavity, a pocket where the quartz had crystallized over millennia into a formation the size of a wagon wheel, shot through with veins of color so dense and heavy that even in the dim candlelight, even half mad with cold and exhaustion, Cray understood immediately what he was looking at. He reached out and put his hand on it. And then the mountain moved. The first collapse wasn't the big one. It was a warning, a section of the tunnel ceiling behind him, maybe 8 feet back, that came down in a grinding rush of fractured granite and shattered timber. The candle snuffed out in the pressure wave of displaced air. Cray hit the ground by instinct, covering his head with his arms, breathing rock dust, tasting blood where a fragment had caught his cheek. He lay still for 30 seconds, then a full minute, listening, feeling the mountain breathe around him in the absolute dark. Then he heard the second section start to go. The sound of a tunnel collapse in full progression is unlike anything else on Earth. It begins as a low, sustained groan, the timber supports working against impossible loads, wood fibers tearing slowly in the compression. Then comes the crack, sharp as a rifle shot, as the wood fails catastrophically. Then the roar and the pressure wave of displaced air hitting your body like a physical blow, and the dark simply becomes more dark as rubble fills the passage behind you and the exit vanishes behind a wall of broken stone. Ezekiel Cray was trapped inside a mountain in a Rocky Mountain blizzard. No light, no way out. The temperature outside was dropping fast enough to kill a healthy man who stayed still, and the temperature inside the tunnel wasn't far behind, and no one in the valley below. Not Harker, the practical thinker, not the children who came to stare, not a single living soul, knew precisely where he was. This is where the difference between a man who truly knows the wilderness and a man who merely visits it becomes the difference between a grave and a story. Cray didn't panic. He'd thought about this possibility before, not obsessively, but practically, the way a man who regularly goes into dangerous places learns to think through the scenarios that could kill him before they actually arrive. He controlled his breathing first, slow and deliberate, even as every nerve in his body was screaming at him to move, to scramble, to claw at the rubble. Panic burns oxygen faster than anything else. In a confined space with compromised airflow, oxygen was the only currency that mattered. He did a complete physical inventory in total darkness, running his hands methodically over his body and his immediate surroundings. He had his pickaxe still in his right hand, by instinct or luck. He had his belt knife. He had a small fire kit in his inside coat pocket. Flint, steel, and a folded piece of oiled cloth he kept there, precisely because there was always a chance he'd need fire in the dark. He had his canteen about half full, a small piece of dried venison in his coat pocket, and pressing against his left shoulder in the darkness, the chunk of crystalline quartz he'd been reaching for when the ceiling came down. He almost laughed at that. Almost. The air told him the most important thing. It was moving, barely, just the faintest whisper across his cheek, so subtle he had to hold completely still to feel it, but moving air meant a gap somewhere in the rubble. Either the collapse wasn't total, or there was a natural fissure in the rock that connected to open air somewhere above. Either way, he wasn't completely sealed. He had more time than a sealed man. He struck a fire from his kit, carefully conserving the oiled cloth, and in the small dancing light assessed what he was dealing with. The rubble pile was dense but not uniform. There were gaps between the larger pieces of granite, irregular voids that a man might work if he was careful and methodical about which stones he moved and in what order. Pulling the wrong piece could bring the whole unstable mass down on top of him. He had to read it the way he'd learned to read the rock itself, looking for the structure underneath the chaos, the logic that governed which pieces were bearing weight and which were just filling space. He began to dig, not with urgency, with precision, moving the pieces he could move without disturbing the ones above them, shoring up gaps with fragments of the broken timber as he went, using longer pieces of wood as levers to shift granite slabs that would have been impossible to budge by brute force alone. He worked for 7 hours. He knew the time because he counted candle burns. Each tallow candle lasted roughly 40 minutes, and he burned through 10 of his remaining 12 before he felt the pressure change in the air. That meant he was approaching the outer face of the collapse. By then, he was on his hands and knees, the passage barely wide enough for his shoulders, pushing through a gap that a larger man couldn't have fit through at all. His arms were shaking. His vision was narrowing at the edges in a way that told him the air quality was dropping, and he needed to move faster. The last section of rubble shifted when he drove a timber fragment underneath the keystone and put every remaining ounce of his strength into the lever. The stone moved. Cold air, bitterly, savagely cold, blizzard wind cold, came screaming through the gap like something alive. Snow followed it. He pushed through the opening head first into a white wall of storm, clawed forward on his elbows through 18 inches of fresh snow, and collapsed face down on the mountainside in the howling dark. He lay there for a long time. The storm was still raging. The cold was profound and immediate and dangerous. He needed to get to the shelter. He knew that. He just needed 1 minute first. Just 1 minute of lying still in the snow with the sky above him and the mountain behind him and his lungs full of cold, open air. When the storm broke 3 days later, Cray was alive in his shelter, half frozen, badly dehydrated, surviving on the last scraps of his smoked elk meat and snow melted in a tin cup held over a small fire. He'd made it to the shelter that night more by feel and stubbornness than anything else, navigating a blizzard he couldn't see through by keeping the rock face on his left and moving downhill. He hadn't let go of the quartz specimen, not once, not through any of it. He had it assessed at the trading post when he was well enough to walk down. The factor who looked it over, a careful, unsentimental man from Pennsylvania who'd handled enough fool's gold to know the difference immediately, went very quiet when he turned it in his hands. He set it down on the counter. He picked it up again. Then he named a figure that made two of the settlers standing nearby exchange a look they thought Cray didn't see. But that single specimen was nothing compared to what the pocket held. Once Cray had reinforced the tunnel properly, seasoned timber this time, properly dried, carefully spaced, fitted with the precision of a man who had learned an expensive lesson about the difference between good enough and actually right. And once he'd worked the pocket fully over the following 3 months, the total yield was something that transformed not just his circumstances, but his entire understanding of what his life could be. Mountain men who found gold didn't always handle it well. The history of the frontier is littered with men who struck it rich and died broke, who drank their fortunes away in 6 months and were back to trapping the following spring with nothing to show for it. Cray had seen enough of those men to know he didn't want to be one of them. He bought land in the valley, proper deeded land with water rights attached, the kind of land that meant something long after the gold was gone. He brought his sister and her husband and their 3 children out from Missouri, gave them a stake and a place to build on. He funded the construction of a grist mill that the whole surrounding community had needed for years, which generated income that would outlast any gold pocket by decades. And he bought books, crates of them, shipped out from back east at considerable expense. Geological surveys, engineering texts, correspondence courses from mining schools that were beginning to formalize what men like Cray had learned the hard way, because he understood something that the men in the valley, the ones who'd watched him dig and called it madness, would never quite grasp. The mountain hadn't just given him gold. It had given him an education, and he intended to use it. He located 2 more significant ore deposits in the decade that followed. The second was silver found using the same method, following quartz, reading strata, ignoring the conventional wisdom about where valuable ore was and wasn't supposed to be. The third was copper, in a range that most prospectors had written off entirely. The copper turned out to be worth more over the long run than either of the others, because copper was what the country needed as it began to wire itself for the future that was coming, whether the frontier was ready for it or not. The settlers who'd watched Ezekiel Cray drive a pickaxe into that mountainside and shaken their heads, they saw a stubborn, possibly unhinged man doing something that made no sense. What they couldn't see was that he was having a conversation with the earth itself, in a language that had taken him years to learn, and that the mountain was only willing to speak to those patient enough to listen. The wilderness of the American frontier in the 1800s was not a place that rewarded recklessness. The men who survived it, the real ones, not the romanticized versions, were the ones who combined raw physical toughness with something rarer, the ability to think clearly under conditions designed to make clear thinking impossible. Cold, isolation, exhaustion, the slow erosion of certainty that sets in when months pass and results don't come, and every reasonable person around you is telling you that you're wrong. Cray had all of that. He had it in the dark after the collapse, when panic would have killed him faster than the rubble. He had it through the winter months when the vein went dead twice, and he had to reason his way back to it instead of giving up or guessing. He had it at the trading post when a lesser man might have taken the money and disappeared into the kind of life that doesn't require much thinking at all. The tunnel is still up there, somewhere in the San Juan Range, collapsed in now, reclaimed by the mountain over the century and a half since a single candle burned inside it. The timber is long rotted. The quartz pocket is exhausted. But the rock face where he started, where he drove the first stroke of a pickaxe into a cliff that everyone else walked past, that's still there, marked by the kind of weathered scars that only a practiced eye would recognize for what they are. If you know what you're looking for, you can still find it. That was always the point.